500 years ago, a middle-aged Spaniard came to this part of Florida searching for the Fountain of Youth. Ponce de Leon never found it. But in 1992, it seems Jim Huden did. Like de Leon, Huden was a middle-aged wanderer. But unlike the conquistador, the locals loved Jim Huden.
Jim was always a happy-go-lucky, fun guy.
And he was just a wonderful human being.
A very witty guy, just charming. You know, everybody loved him.
A native of Washington State, Huden's first fans in Punta Gorda were customers at his computer store. Former Mayor Marilyn Mooney was one of those.
He was brilliant with computers. In fact, you could go in there and they would build a computer for you.
But it was Huden's band, Buck Naked and the Exhibitionists, BNX for short, that made him one of the most popular people in Punta Gorda. Tim Goodman played keyboards in the band.
We had two names to decide on. It was Buck Naked and the Exhibitionists or Les Moore and the Contradictions. so we picked Buck Naked, but he came up with both names. I mean, that's the way his brain worked. He's a brilliant guy.
Bill Hill, the band's bass player, says Huden was also a guy who never liked to let wives or girlfriends get in the way of a good time.
I had a lot of fun.
Safe to say that you were kind of his wingman. He covered for you, you covered for him.
Yes, indeed.
All you got to do is
Golden oldies, like Wilson Pickett's 634-5789, were the band's bread and butter.
634-5789.
Lead singer Al Holland used to perform with the Platters. He said that whenever Buck Naked played, people would dance.
We would pack the place every single Friday and Saturday night, and it would just be one very big party.
Must have been fun to be part of the big band in town.
It was.
Oh yeah, it was.
The band was so hot, in fact, that Jim Huden eventually turned over the computer store to his top assistant, Gene Spender, so he could concentrate on music.
I kind of pushed him towards doing that because I knew that was his love, and that's where he was most happy.
Were you in love with him?
Very much so. I love that man very much.
So much so that in December 2001, after 6 years of living together, Gene and Jim got married in Las Vegas.
And I was asked by Jean if I would walk her down the aisle.
Was she happy?
Oh yeah. All smiles. Both of them were all smiles.
But the smiles did not last long. In June 2002, Jim Huden returned here to Washington State for the funeral of an old friend. And it was here that fate intervened. A tall, red-haired beauty caught Jim's eye. It was the beginning of a love triangle, one that would wreck the lives of all the people who were involved, and some who were not. The woman in question was Peggy Thomas, a Whidbey Island hairstylist who also dabbled in beauty pageants.
Ms. Washington, Peggy Thomas.
In fact, in 2001, Thomas represented the state of Washington in a Las Vegas pageant, winning the evening gown competition.
Congratulations, Peggy.
Leslie Birkeland got to know Peggy Thomas a few years earlier, when she was just breaking into the beauty pageant circuit. Birkeland, who now appears on the reality TV show Big Rich Texas,
I still consider myself new to Dallas.
says Peggy Thomas was working as an auto mechanic at the time.
You couldn't not notice Peggy because she was a whole lot of gorgeous woman.
Would you say she's a typical pageant contestant?
No, not in 1998. Here's this beautiful, voluptuous, redhead, gorgeous woman, and she was a mechanic. She had this guy kind of job. It just sort of added to her sex appeal.
Though Jean says she knew nothing of her husband's budding affair at the time, she did notice that he had returned from his friend's funeral, a changed man, secretive, sullen, and withdrawn.
I think Jim's sister-in-law had mentioned Peggy to me, and I didn't quite put two and two together. She made some comment about them being there at the funeral, and it just didn't click because I didn't want to acknowledge it.
Jean says she later found emails and letters from this Peggy, and that the woman even called her home looking for Jim. But Jean says that Jim told her Peggy was simply a music contact who could get him gigs in Las Vegas. Worrisome, to be sure, but Jean says It was her husband's heavy drinking that really had her concerned.
He started drinking constantly at home and, drinking to obliterate himself, basically, to numb himself. And then he started making trips out west.
Did you at the time think that there was another woman?
No, I had no idea.
There is, of course, no cure for willful blindness. But Bill Hill, Hewden's faithful wingman, knew the truth about those out-of-town trips, because sometimes he'd been along for the ride.
We came out to Las Vegas. The reason that he asked me to go was to cover for him.
He was seeing Peggy.
Yes.
Tell me about Jim's relationship with Peggy.
Oh, it was all love and kisses.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
More so than with Gene, who was waiting for him back home?
Yes.
Before long, other band members say that they too began seeing the same changes in Jim that troubled Gene: heavy drinking and erratic behavior.
You go through a fifth of Crown Royal in the night. And one night, I'm calling chord changes to the bass player. And he hollers at me in the middle of a song, "Quit criticizing the bass player," or something like that. And I hollered back at him, "Why don't you just keep your mouth quiet? I'm doing my job over here." And he shut his guitar off and walked off stage, which is about the most unprofessional thing you can do.
After that, the band's days were numbered. And seemingly, so were the days of Gene Hewden's marriage. But Gene says the drinking and philandering were not the worst of it.
Jim at one point had told me that he wanted to know what it felt like to kill somebody.
He told you that he had wanted to know that.
Yes, his deep, dark secrets.
And you say, what? Sure, great idea, honey?
I didn't know what to say.
Who would? Gene could only guess at what was behind this sudden change.
He lost his dad when he was, I believe, 10, 11 years old, and his mom dated a series of men throughout that were abusive, drunks, and he saw his mom get beat up many, many times. He wasn't able to do anything, and he always swore he would get this guy, but the man who mostly beat her has since passed away.
Jean didn't know if something back in Washington had triggered her husband's black moods, but she says she remained determined to pull him through.
I loved that man more than life itself at the time. I was so in love with him. I thought he was the one.
Even though he was in the process of treating you like dirt.
Right. I was hoping that it could be salvaged.
Then came the day in June 2003 when the cold, hard facts of her husband's affair could no longer be denied. Jim moved out, telling Jean that he needed a change of scenery for his music. Jean knew better.
It's like they're going back to see Peggy. I was like, go, get out, don't ever come back again. And he didn't want to hear that. He still wanted me to be hanging on while he had Peggy as well.
That moment of clarity, it turns out, was short-lived. All that summer, while Jim Hewden set up housekeeping with Peggy and her 2 daughters out in Las Vegas, Jean says her husband kept her dangling with promises that his dalliance with Peggy Thomas was over. He'd soon be home, he told her. And for Jean, that was a reason to believe.
I thought there was some hope. I didn't want to let go.
And for a brief moment in September of 2003, Jean says it looked as if her perseverance would pay off. Jim invited her out to Las Vegas for her 40th birthday. For several days, he wined and dined her. But her dreams of a happy ending, she says, vanished when her husband turned to her in bed one night and told her he intended to make his darkest dreams come true. There was a man out in Washington, he told her, who needed to die.
Not the kind of thing a wife wants to hear, but Jean has an even bigger shock coming.
It was like getting kicked in the stomach. Life, as I knew it, was over at that point.
When Dateline continues.